In this short video presentation, I want to be able to just put into context some of the work of Paul Schmitz that you'll be reading this week. And as we begin to launch our Cultivating Partnership, to kind of ground this in some understandings of what it means to be a leader who's also aware of the importance of creating a partnership. So in our scriptures, many of us might be aware of those scriptures that are in Ephesians, for example, that says that to equip the saints for the work of ministry, for building up the body of Christ, until all of us come to the unity of faith and the knowledge of the Son of God, and to maturity, to the measure of the full stature of Christ. That ministry itself is not just about the minister, about her work, her leadership, his work. It's about actually equipping the saints and engaging all of us as a community into the work of living out, proclaiming, and becoming church. So in their book, The Equipping Pastor, Paul Stevens and Phil Collins point out that it's a cultural shift for many of us to begin to evaluate what are we currently doing in relationship to equipping the saints, bringing forth the gifts, the possibilities, and the strengths of those in our community. And drawing upon Edgar Schein's work around culture, they ask these particular questions that I think are helpful questions for us to consider as we assess what is our current status in terms of equipping the saints. So the questions they ask us, does our environment prize the contributions of lay people just as much as clergy? Are people prized as people, not for what they, who they are in our community, and not merely for the contributions that they can make or for what they can do? Is there a kind of a valuing of people as part of this community in a way that's not always just aligned for particularly their role and what they do in their own role? What values and beliefs have been embedded in our culture from our founders and our traditions? Particularly those of you who are part of a new congregation, let's say, you've been a big part of the founding of that. And usually as you begin as a pastor in a new congregation, you're having to be much more entrepreneurial and much more directive in getting things to happen. But over time, you need to find a new balance in order to bring forth the gifts, the strengths, the capacities beyond that founding stage. Even if you're working in a hospital or other settings, you need to begin to look at how are things structured. Oftentimes, the hierarchical structure might be one that doesn't allow some of the collaborative approaches and ways of working together across disciplines and across different levels of the organization in order to get things done. Another question they ask is, am I willing to share freely visible roles of leadership in the church or in the organization with people who are gifted and equipped to do so? Why or why not? So how do we bring forth the capacities and the capabilities of others in such a way that we're not, in a sense, hogging the ministry, but we're sharing that ministry. We're not hogging leadership, but we're finding ways to share leadership in the way that Schmitz talks about everyone leads. Who does get recognition in our community or organization? Who should be recognized that might not be? And then the final question they ask is, what incongruities do I see between my stated goals in leadership and the cultural realities of our community? This last question, I think, is a really important one, and I'll revisit it again towards the end of this short presentation. But we're always having to look at the gaps between what it is that we say, that's our espoused values, and what actually we do, our theory and use, our espoused theory and our theory and use. Sometimes those can be aligned, and sometimes there can be a gap between the two. So Paul Schmitz actually draws from the whole literature and practice of asset-based community organizing and community development, which some of you might know was developed by John McKnight and others. In a recent article that John McKnight and Jody Kretzmann wrote, which I've provided in your Moodle for this week, they ask these questions. And they encourage us as leaders to ask these questions as we think about moving forward towards development of our own congregation or organization, and as we look towards working on our adaptive challenge. So these questions are, what can community members do best for themselves and each other? So as we think about this, we could replace community members with organization members or congregation members. What can community members do best if they receive some support from the organization or the organization's leaders? And what can organizations do best for communities that people can't do for themselves? What can the ordained clergy or the hired members of an organization, chaplains and others, do best for those communities that they can't do for themselves? So really what these questions allow us to look at are we over-functioning in a way that suppresses the leadership and the capability and the development of the members of our organizations? Have we created a kind of dependency that keeps things stuck in such a way that the broader ownership and responsibility for the adaptive challenge can't happen because we've created this culture of dependency? And what are the things that are our unique role to do, and how does that differ from the roles that members in our congregation or organization might take? So we all know that asset-based community development is really based on a methodology that engages members to look at the gifts individuals have in an organization and bringing those assets forward. And also looking at the communities, the community that surrounds an organization, places of worship, neighborhood groups and associations and cultural groups, and asking what are the assets that they can bring to a change, and then other local institutions. So again, they're broadening the lens to looking at a congregation or organization in partnership with others in the community in order to make change happen. And you'll see in the article that I provided by Schmitz and others, that they ask the question, can we really lead these days? Can we lead organizations without a sense of partnership? And I think for congregation leaders, this is an important question as well, because sometimes we are taxing the resources of our own institution because we're trying to do it all ourselves. And we have to create new partnerships and new alliances with others if we're going to have a broader impact. So this is quite a shift, particularly for those congregations that had a lot of resources in the past, that had a large civic identity of what it is that they could do. And there was a time when they could manage to do things on their own. But in the nonprofit world, but also in the religious world, these kind of partnerships are going to be most important in order to leverage most resources, both financial resources, but also the people resources. And we're beginning to see this a lot in interfaith alliances and other kinds of things that are happening that are bringing groups together so that they can have a broader impact. As a leader, we need to have this lens too, and always ask ourselves, how do we create more partnership to have more leverage? More partnership with members of our own local community or organization or congregation, as well as other organizations in that community. So in the article, you can see that there's a spectrum of community engagement, and you need to ask yourself, you know, at what makes sense, which level of community engagement makes sense for the particular adaptive challenge that I'm working on and proposing. So you can see the article and maybe read it's less fuzzy in the article, but you can see the big type here. Informing is one area of engagement. Another is consulting with others. Another is actually involving community members. Another is collaborating, and another is empowering. So this is a spectrum of decision making, and you might ask yourself, in terms of your own adaptive challenge, who do I need to inform? Who do I want to consult with? Who do I need to involve in this particular adaptive challenge? What collaborations can I begin to start or continue? And who do I need to empower in order to make this change happen? When we can think in this broader spectrum way, we can begin to recognize that what we're trying to do as a leader is not do it all ourselves, but create opportunities for deeper engagement over time. And sometimes, because we've latched on to one area of this spectrum, we might find ourselves frustrated. So, for example, we might be trying to involve some people before we've informed them or consulted with them. We might be trying to empower when we really haven't developed and cultivated partnership over time, which might be educating and informing and engaging people and seeing the reason and the rationale for a particular change, consulting with them and getting their own input, and then involving them gradually in experiments and other things to help bring that change about, and then collaborating and over time empowering people. So if we can see this spectrum as a as a way that the artistry of our leadership can be practiced, I think this will allow us to move beyond some of the frustrations that I hear some of you are experiencing in your current settings. So one of the ways to understand leadership is to understand that we need to shift some of our paradigms, some of our fixed ways of thinking about leaders. We live in a culture, a patriarchal culture, that oftentimes has highlighted the kind of individual hero type leader. And a lot of the literature around leadership does reinforce that. Lynn Rhodes, in a book that's been around for quite a while, I think makes a good point. That individual leaders will not save us, she says. We will not find the perfect formula for leadership that will provide what we need at this time in history. Instead, we have to rethink our understanding of what it means to be Christian communities. Instead of starting from the perspective of the individual, we need to start with the critique of the community and then envision new possibilities for our future. So again, she's asking us to look at the community. What does the community want to be and to become? And how do we cultivate partnership and the capacity for co-creating in order for ministry to really occur and to happen? So this capacity to develop partnership is not just a technique, not just a tactic. It also can be theologically grounded in your own understanding of leadership. There's a lot of emphasis sometimes in the broader culture and even in the culture of the church about this individual perspective on leadership. But hopefully you've already begun to understand that adaptive work in leadership means that the individual leader does not take on the responsibility of making the adaptive work of doing the adaptive work for the community, but gives the adaptive work to the community so that they can begin to move forward in the changes. So we're trying to shift culture. We're trying to focus energy and attention. We're trying to get people beyond some of the barriers of avoiding work avoidance is what Heifetz calls it, in order to begin to develop a broader ownership for the adaptive work of a congregation. So our leadership as religious leaders should always be informed by some understanding of what are we trying to create together. Bell Hooks says everyone's presence and participation must be valued. And indeed, we need to find ways that becomes less of an idea and more of a practice as we live out our leadership day to day. So in the book by Paul Schmitz, which hopefully you'll begin to read this week, he presents his own definition, or the definition of his organization, around what leadership is. And you'll see this in the book, Everyone Leads. He says leadership is an action that many can take, not a position few can hold. So again, from the Heifetz work, we can begin to see a trajectory here that leadership is not the authoritative role that someone has, but it's the actions that one takes, the practices that one engages in. And if leadership is understood as a verb rather than a noun, as actions, then we can begin to see that part of our role as a leader is to develop partnerships and cultivate partnership so that others can take those actions as well. The other part of their definition is leadership is about taking responsibility, both personal and social, to work with others towards common goals. So it doesn't mean neglecting one's own responsibility because of the position or role that you have, but it also means to find ways in which to share that responsibility, ability to respond over time, once you're clear about what some of the common goals are. And finally, their definition is that leadership is about the practice of values that engage community members and groups to work effectively towards those common goals. And so there are certain values that are going to support the capacity of a group to work effectively together. And in this book, Everyone Leads, there's lots of stories that illustrate these principles. And in the video that I've posted with Paul Schmitz this week, you'll hear some of the stories that he draws from history and from his own life experiences and from the experiences of people that he's worked with that demonstrate each of these principles that are listed here. So as you look at this, begin to, again, revisit your own understanding of leadership. What is your definition? Does it enable you to cultivate partnership, or does it inhibit your capacity to cultivate partnership? Does it put too much responsibility on the individual? Does it also focus on how to engage? Does it also focus your energy and attention on how to engage others in the adaptive work of leading? So there is the concept of having an espoused theory, what we say about our leadership, and a theory in use. And sometimes those are aligned, and most often there can be a gap between what we say our leadership is about and what actually happens in our leadership. So this is drawn, as some of you may know, from the work of Chris Argyris and Donald Schoen. Their theory is that oftentimes our behavior is based on these mental models. If I do this, then this will happen. Or I want to be more like this as a leader, or an effective leader as this. And this is our own model of, or theory about how the world works, and we use that model to guide our behavior. So part of the rationale and the reasoning of the reflection papers and the work on a particular adaptive challenge in this course is for you to begin to really look at and observe your own mental model, and hopefully begin to add to it and develop it over this course by taking in the input and the perspectives of your colleagues and some of the reading that you're doing. But we're often actually not aware of our mental models. We're acting from those interpretive lenses, oftentimes with not articulating them. In the day-to-day life of ministry, oftentimes we're so busy doing that we don't take the reflective time, the balcony time, to actually say, well, what is the doing that I'm engaged in? What is that actually based on? So the model that we actually use is what Chris Argyris and Donald Schoen call our theory in use. And it's usually those who are observing us that can see our theory in use. Usually it's the members of our organization, members of our congregations, and others that can begin to see, well, what does it actually look like? What does our leadership actually look like? And when we describe how we behave, we give our espouse we give that our espoused theory, but the espoused theory is often very different from our theory in use, and it's only from the feedback from others that we can begin to see that gap. So it would be good for us to not just answer the question for ourselves, how would you lead in this situation, but also how did you lead in this situation. The how did you lead is the theory in use. The how would you is the theory, the espoused theory that we have. Both are important, and in this course and in the work that we're doing, we're wanting to see how we might bring both together. How, as we're refining our espoused theory and reflecting on our own practice or our theory in use, how those might inform and be strengthened together. So let's have a good week as we begin this exploration on cultivating partnership. And as you're writing your paper, you might keep some of the questions that I've raised here in your mind as well.